Melissa check to make sure that the stream is going. It looks like it went through. As far as I can tell, welcome everybody. I think the live stream is in fact happening. It's good to have you here. Everyone who is here joining me live on the Zoom call, and everyone who is finding us through the live streaming. This is also being archived and recorded, so you may be seeing this maybe tomorrow, or you may be seeing it next year. I don't know. And whenever you connect, it's good to have you. It's good to have you here with us on this second session of our course on the history of Zionism. So we say Bruchim Habayim, blessed are those who have come here tonight. Welcome to all of you. I want to start tonight. I know I didn't do a good job at it last time, but I try to start and end every course and everything that we do here at Bet Aleph with a chant, the chant of Shalom, the chant of peace, the chant of wholeness and harmony. So I invite you to simply close your eyes and to take perhaps a few mindful breaths. And to let go of the day that was. And to find ourselves right here, right now, together in this space. And from that groundedness, from that centeredness, I invite you, if you so choose, to take a breath for Shalom. יהיו לרצון אמרתי והגיון ליבי לפניך, Adonai. Holy One of Being, help us to know your presence in this space, in this time, right here between us. Wherever we are, whenever we are. Holy One, let the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart flow from the fullness of your being. And help me to know, to remember that you are Source. And you are Liberator. Amen. So I am aware that I left us in quite an untenable suspense at the end of our last session. And I know that you are all sitting at the edge of your seat, waiting to learn about what happened in 1881. What were the pogroms of 1881? And we will get that. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But first, I want to answer a few questions that were emailed to me since we last met. because I felt that they were very relevant to our conversation, to what it is we're trying to do here. And by the way, let me say that I always deeply appreciate the questions that you put here in the chat or that you email me. Please never hesitate to do so. I read everything, and when I am able to, I make a point to answer your questions. In this case, I even emailed some of you saying, do you mind if I address your questions during the class instead of directly responding? Because I felt, like I said, that it would be relevant for everyone to benefit from the questions and from the responses. And it's also true that I don't have answers to all the questions, and I will let you know for sure when that's the case. So one of the questions that I received, and maybe more of a comment than a question, was a very interesting argument that I wasn't quite fully aware was an argument that was made, but there's so many arguments when it comes to Zionism that I wasn't surprised to hear that this was in the ether, that this was that it was things that people talked about or things that they have heard from someone who said, but it seems to be a myth from somewhere, some propaganda, I guess I would call it, that the Jews have abrogated their rights to the promised land because for thousands of years it has been empty of any Jewish presence. So that was kind of an interesting argument to hear. Again, I wasn't familiar with that particular one, but I am hoping that I have shown that this is actually not the case. In our previous class, I'm hoping that I have made it clear that those attacks or those arguments were actually not true, that Jews stayed in the land, the promised land, since biblical times. There always was a presence there. That fundamentally we never abandoned the land, we never left the land. And you probably will read in the assigned readings for this week that even, you know, by all the accounts, historical, scholarly accounts, we know that at the turn of the millennia, there were about 100,000 Jews who lived in the promised land, which, you know, at the time, before we were 8 billion on this planet, 100,000 people in any place, it was a lot of people 1,000 years ago. And we unfortunately didn't remain in those kinds of numbers for one reason, really, and that reason is the Crusades. And the Crusades were devastating to the Jewish people, the Jewish presence in the land. And from what scholars and historians tell us, from that 100,000 Jews who were there at the time, about 1,000 years ago, there only were a few thousands, only 5, 6, 7,000, depend on which account, that remained in the promised land, which means that the Crusaders either killed, converted, or forced Jews into further exile. 95% of the Jewish population, close to 95%, was either massacred, converted by force, or exiled from the land. And still, with all the, you know, all the different waves of conquests and violence, still all this time, I hope that I have shown that there was always a Jewish presence in the land. Another question, or maybe also a comment that was made or emailed to me was the more known, I don't know if it's an accusation, but argument, let's say, that Israel was created on the back end of the Holocaust because the Western world felt guilty of what had happened to the Jewish people, and therefore, from a place of guilt, decided to bestow upon the surviving Jews the land of Israel at the expense of the Muslim world. That accusation I have heard come from Islam, from Muslim propaganda, but it's possible that it can be found in other places. And we'll see, actually, I hope to show that Israel independence could actually have been proclaimed long before World War II started. In fact, many historians would argue that it was the leading up to the war and then the war itself that stopped the creation of Israel and Palestine. The vision at the time was for a two-state solution, but it was the war and the British who ruled over Palestine at the time that, for reasons that I will show, actually stopped Jewish immigration to Palestine and stopped the process of creating a two-state solution because of the war. So it's not, it has little to do with the Holocaust. It has more to do with British preparation towards the war, strategic thinking about how the war might unfold, which allies they might need. I'll talk more about all of that, obviously toward the end of the course. But it was really more about the British government and their hesitation and their exasperation with both the Jews and the Muslims in the land that was at the time the British mandate to rule over. And they really dumped their problem with the Jews and the Muslims of Palestine onto the lap of the newly founded United Nations and said, "You guys deal with it. We don't want to have to deal with anything. We're gonna leave, and you figure it out." So we'll see actually how that happened, but again, it has very little to do with the Holocaust. Quite the opposite. The Holocaust was an obstacle. Well, the war, not the Holocaust. The war was an obstacle to the independence of Israel and Palestine, as was planned at the time. The third question was this: I wonder to what extent the Muslims and Christians living there understood Palestine as their homeland. So some of that will be addressed in the assigned readings for this week, which you will receive tomorrow. And especially in the first two chapters that I shared from the Sachar book, the very thick one that I showed you last time, which is right here. Every week, this is our main text. So every week I will make a PDF of the chapters that I invite you to read, and the two that are assigned for this week will talk at length about that question. Let me just say this, because it will really set the stage for where I want to get to in just a moment, which is the 1881 pogroms and the first aliyah that followed, the first wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine. And by the way, since I'm mentioning that word, the first aliyah, that word is the word that Jews use for emigration. There is no word for emigration to Israel. When Jews talk about relocating to the promised land, we use the word aliyah, and this is the same word that we use when someone is called up in Jewish Shabbat services or bar mitzvahs, to chant from the Torah. Someone who comes to chant from the sacred book of the Jews, from the Jewish Bible, from the Torah, is making an aliyah. Why? Because the word itself, aliyah, means climbing, means to go up. And when you're invited to read from the Torah, there's a sense that you are going up, that you are rising in consciousness, that you are being spiritually elevated in order to do that. Because the Torah is seen to be in a higher plane, higher spiritual plane. So you have to go up to meet the Torah on that higher plane in order to chant from its pages. And we use the same word when it comes to relocating to Israel, because in Jewish consciousness, to go to Israel, to relocate to Israel, Israel is like the Torah. Israel, in a spiritual sense, because it is the place where the temple once stood. It is the place that was our land for 1,000 years. It is a spiritual ascent, if you want. So you go up to Israel when you relocate to Israel physically, right? There is a physical horizontal movement, right, as you relocate. But for us, there's also a vertical spiritual movement that happens at the same time. I wish that was true on the ground, and that Israelis would be more spiritually elevated. But it's a nice idea, and it's just the way we refer to it, which is, to me, it's always interesting. So the Jews that made Aliyah, the Jews who relocated to Israel through the first 2/3 of the 19th century, right? The Jews who came to Israel, I mean, on a regular basis, all over the centuries, but specifically before 1881. And the Jews who joined them in the 20 years that followed 1881, those Jews were mostly religious Jews. It's important to understand that. They were mostly, overwhelmingly actually, with rare exception, mostly religious Jews. There were a few dozen secular idealists among them that may have had a nationalistic vision, but overwhelmingly, these Jews were religious families escaping oppression and violence. They were refugees from the horrors of Eastern Europe, from the horrors of Yemen, as we will see, or actually wherever else they escaped from. They came to the land, they came to Palestine with nothing, really with nothing, or barely nothing. And they settled there as best they could, really facing the hardship of a land that they had heard about, that they had read about, that they saw in the Torah, but that they really never physically encountered, a land that really they didn't know. And they came with really no vision, except for a few dozens that I mentioned, no vision to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. That was the farthest thing from their mind. There was not something that they had in consciousness. They came because they sought refuge, and they came to the land because of their ancestral connection to the land. And as religious people, they wanted to be part of mostly the four holy cities in Jerusalem, Hebron, Tzfat, and Tiberias. Those were the four sacred cities in Israel, and for them that was their religious impulse to go back to the promised land. And because as you will read through these chapters, because that's who came home, that's who returned to Israel. It always is kind of dissonant for me when I hear um, those who are screaming that, wanting to paint a picture of those Jews of the first major wave of return as, a colonialist force. That's in their mind. It seems that we're like the British or the French or the German armies, invading and stealing the land. They have this vision, or probably from ignorance, but they paint this picture of Jews like as a colonialist force, and you have this sense that it was the Indian who colonized the British who colonized India. When you have the armada of the British Empire coming ashore, and it's such a radical difference with what actually happened in these decades of the Jews first returning to the promised land. It was nothing like colonial armies who conquered by force and reduced the local population into slavery. It's like we were not the redcoats, decimating the native tribes here on the East Coast to establish the first 12 colonies at the end of our bayonets. That's not at all the reality, the historical reality of this waves of Jews returning to the promised land. Not only were we a bunch of desperate, destitute refugees, but we didn't come back to Palestine, like I said, with any notion of nationalistic fervor. These Jews were, again, religious Jews. They knew very little about, and they were definitely not interested in any kind of nationalistic ideals. They understood Jewish peoplehood as a religious, I would say, a religious order. It's not the right word, but you know what I mean. As Jews understood themselves for thousands of years. Right? Their identity as Jews at the time was completely wrapped around Jewish religious practices. It's really only in modern times, really only because of the Enlightenment, as I mentioned last session, that there was a shift in consciousness. But understand that this newfound awareness really was only present and unfolding in Western Europe and in America, right? That didn't appear in the consciousness of Eastern European religious Jews, right? If they were a handful of those who had heard of what was going on in Western Europe, in Kiev, in Odessa, in Lithuania, in Warsaw, they were like completely on the margins of the Jewish world, of the Jewish community, of the Pale of Settlement. And I would venture to say that they were not welcome. If anyone had heard of them, they were probably not welcome. The second thing that is important to know is that the land at the time, the land that was called Palestine, that land at the time, and since the 1500s, right? So we're at the end of the 1800s. So for almost 400 years, that land had belonged to the Ottoman Empire, to the Ottoman Turks. And that land, that region that was probably called Palestine, I don't even know, was really, as far as the Ottoman Empire was concerned, kind of a backwater region of the empire that Constantinople really, at best, neglected. Didn't really maintain, didn't really invested funds to keep up or to support. And so because of that, it was a harsh area to live in. It was dangerous. It was a swampy land. It was a land that was infected with malaria and other diseases. Most people lived within walled cities and walled little towns for safety reasons. You had marauders, you had Bedouins who roamed the land, and that survived oftentimes on the backs of those who, had ventured out of the walls, out of the walled cities. Traveling through that land wasn't really safe. But I also understand that these walled cities, and there were just a handful of them, and they were walled from, hundreds of years. It's not like they were brand new. Um, they were not all either very safe to live in. They were not very healthy places. A lot of diseases. They were dirty. It was not an easy world to be a part of. And so I doubt, with all of this, I doubt that the Muslim or the Christian residents, let alone the Jews, thought of themselves as Ottoman citizens, even though they were, but they probably felt mostly abandoned by Constantinople. And they most likely, I would venture to say, define themselves according to their religion, as Jews, as people, humanity had done for thousands of years, and probably didn't have a consciousness of we are Ottomans. I can't imagine that being the case. I think they were first and foremost, and maybe only, Jews, Muslims, Christians. That was who they were. And so all of those notions that of nationhood, all this nationalistic consciousness that yes existed at that time in Western Europe and had been around for maybe 100 years at that point, hadn't yet reached neither Eastern Europe, and definitely not, I would venture to say, definitely not the Middle East. And so, to that question, this concept of peoplehood, right? The concept that people understood themselves as individuals having a unifying national identity hadn't spread to that part of the world. And so there was no consciousness around such an identity, right? It could very well be that this region of the Ottoman Empire was still called, from the Roman names, was still maybe called Palestine, but no one understood themselves as Palestinians. Not the Jews, not the Muslims, and not the Christians. That notion wouldn't have crossed their mind. There were Jews, Muslims, and Christians ruled by the Ottomans in this lost administrative region, probably known as Palestine, just as a modality to know where it is we were talking about. Having said that, we will also see that there were two consequential unfoldings that are going to precipitate after World War I the birth of a national consciousness for Muslims and Christians as Palestinians. And the first one we will see was the partition of the Middle East by the European powers who had just defeated the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman armies, and who literally drew lines in the desert sand to create out of thin air countries that we today know as Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, to name just a few. These countries didn't exist until mostly France and England, who were the victors of the conquest of that part of the world, decided among themselves to divide the land in ways that they could manage. And actually, in doing that, they made a huge mess in the Middle East that we are still paying the price for. What they did was just a disaster. But because they drew lines and created countries that didn't exist before in the desert of the Middle East, there began to be an understanding that, oh, I live in this new place called Jordan. Maybe I'm Jordanian. Oh, I live in this new place called Iraq. Well, maybe I'm Iraqi, but that's happening after World War I and in the decades that are going to follow. And it's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen overnight. The second precipitating factor, I would say, for the creation of a notion of Palestinianhood in the Muslim and Christian populations there is actually paradoxically the Zionist movement, the nationalist Zionist movement itself, right? Because here came this movement who started to talk about the national rights of Jews as a nation to create a Jewish state in their backyard, right? And all this talk about nationalism and national identity, the Jewish national identity, awakened in the Muslim and Christian population a sense of, wait a minute, what about us? What about our national identity? What about us, as Palestinians? So these two factors are going to play a huge role in this newfound self-awareness of Muslims and Christians in Palestine as Palestinian. And I think it's critical to understand, as we will see, because from the beginning, the conflict between the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians was not about religion. And that's really important to really get. It became almost immediately a conflict that was nationalistic in essence. And because of that, a conflict about land. It was never about religion. And that's really important. That's really important. Because we hear on all extreme of the conflict, both on the Jewish side and the fervor of some of those radical religious right-wingers who have this vision of this, as far as I'm concerned, dangerous vision of recreating the religious state of Israel, almost like a theocracy, in what they see as the reconquest of the King Solomon's greater kingdom, which was, if you took a look at the maps that I shared with you last week, you can see where the lines of that ideology draws the line, which is, obviously, and we will work as best we can to make sure this vision doesn't come to pass, because obviously that would mean that, they would go ahead and destroy the mosques on the Temple Mount, and I can't even imagine what else would happen. So, you will see that actually the state of Israel was founded on deeply secular socialist communist ideals that rejected religion altogether. So until further notice, that is still what we're going to continue to work towards, and keep Israel not a theocracy, but a strong democracy. And on the other hand, you have also the Muslim religious fanatics of, for example, the Hamas or the Islamic Jihad. And those groups also paint the conflict as a jihad, hence their name, which is a religious term. And that often, just as it does with the religious fanatics in Israel, alienates the Israelis, the secular Israelis, who are the overwhelming 80% of Israel are secular Jews. But it also, alienates a lot of the Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslim folks who don't hold religious extremist views either. But it's important to understand this conflict as it begins to unfold, and we'll get to that obviously very quickly, is not a religious conflict. It's a nationalistic conflict and a conflict over land. At least that's how it started. And to me, that's why we can hopefully get to a peaceful solution between our two people, because we keep it outside of the religious fanatics that are not willing on either side to compromise. Closing this parenthesis. And so up until the early 1900s, to go back to our topic at hand, had been the case in all previous generations of this trickling of Jewish return to the promised land. Those who came back and started to build new Jewish communities, and those Jews and non-Jews who already lived in the land, none of them had any nationalistic individual identity. They cohabitated, they lived together as religious groups, sharing the land that was sacred to all of them. And they did that under the authority and the rule of the Ottoman Sultan, who ruled over them and to whom at that time the land belonged. That's also very important, right? At that time, since the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire was the latest owner of that part of land. So I hope I was able to answer those very wonderful questions and really kind of set the base for what happened in 1881. So let's go back to our interrupted program. I don't remember how they used to say that. So the pogroms of 1881. In March of 1881, the Russian Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, and his successor, Alexander III, turned against, surprise, the Jews, accusing them of obviously being responsible, and just to probably channel the anger of his people towards the assassinations of the Tsar, found, who are we going to beat up so that we can let go of the pent-up anger within us, and find a target to let all of that angry energy loose. Kind of what we did here after 9/11, right? Which country can we invade, to channel all that anger that was caused by 9/11? So the same kind of, human dark forces. So Alexander III turned against the Jews. His interior minister, whose name was, and I'm not a Russian speaker, so I'm going to do a terrible job. I think I would pronounce it Ignatiev. However his name was pronounced, he was known to be a vicious anti-Semite. And so the pogroms began at his instigation immediately in April of 1881. So literally days, maybe weeks after the assassination of Alexander II. And by the end of that year, so between April and December, some 100 pogroms had taken place in the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. And Jews were not only murdered, but 20,000 of them were left homeless. Women were raped, and property damage was immense for the Jewish community. Jewish quarters in Russian cities and towns were absolutely ransacked and in many cases set on fire altogether. And the attacks continued for 3 years. 3 years. And as you can imagine, set off mass reaction of Jewish flight from Russia. And most of that flight, most of that exile in the years that followed was directed towards the United States. Over 2 million Jews of Eastern Europe emigrated to the US, including, if you know Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye and Golda and all the Jews of Anatevka. And I would venture to say, if you have Jewish ancestry, Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, your family, your ancestors came from Eastern Europe to America in the years that followed, probably the early pogroms in those first 3 years. There was a wave of immigration, massive wave of immigration to America in the 1880s, but also, as we will see, in the early 1900s, when another major wave of pogroms are going to strike once again in Russia, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So 2 million Jews would have relocated over the years that followed these pogroms. Tens of thousands are going to go to Central Europe, to England, some to Australia and South Africa, and obviously in many other places. A tiny minority joined Jews from Yemen who were also fleeing their own pogroms, and decided that they would find and try to find their future in Ottoman Palestine. And they represented the start of what was called the first Aliyah, that eventually included 25,000 Jews in total. So that's why I'm saying a small minority when you compare to 2 million who immigrated to America, to the United States. 25,000 will make Aliyah, as I mentioned earlier. And those who, were voicefully advocating for the Jews to relocate to the land, to the promised land, couched it in their discourses, some of their writings, as shaking off the chains of the past, giving up on hopes for assimilation, They wrote about restarting life in the land of our ancestors. And you will read a beautiful passage by Lillian Bloom, who wrote after the pogroms, and I just quote from one of the readings that are assigned for this week. Alien we are, and alien we shall remain, even if we become full to the brim with European culture. And he was one of the ones in his writing who argued that the only choice for the oppressed and the hated Jews of Eastern Europe was to emigrate to the land of Israel. But again, emigrating there, making Aliyah, was the choice of a small minority of Jews. And many who actually remained, who didn't go to America, didn't go to Western Europe, who didn't go to Israel, those who said they were going to try and survive in Eastern Europe, actually, many of them abandoned religion, became very secular. And in fact, since, again, this is the late 1800s, you know politically what's happening, and especially in Russia, right? They embraced these new political ideologies called socialism and communism, and joined the ranks of the beginning of those revolutionaries who were trying to change Russia. And the Jews who embraced that thought that they could, through socialism, through communism, finally bring to life a regime that, if not Jewish, at least because of the tenets of that political ideology, would do away with religion. And maybe the fact that there would be no religion in this newly created political sphere, then with the removal of religion, then Jews would not be persecuted anymore. We would remove that obstacle by eliminating religion in this new ideal of communist or socialist utopias, right? So a lot of Jews who stayed in Eastern Europe became part of this socialist and communist movement to try to change Russia from within. And we know how that turned out for the Jews, the Russian Jews, when that became a reality. But let's come back to those who left, those who came to Palestine, those Yemenite Jews and those Eastern European Jewish refugees who fled those pogroms. They took their chance in the Ottoman Palestine. And so we can think of them as early non-Zionist because they had not embraced that nationalist idea, but we can think of them as the early non-Zionist Zionists that will actually, in fact, inspire the actual creation of the Zionist movement that followed. Now, who were they? And I mentioned a little bit about them. Who were they? Most of them, like I said earlier, were similar to the traditional immigrant to Palestine. They came for religious reasons, and they overwhelmingly settled in the areas of Jerusalem. Some settled in Jaffa, Hebron, the city of Acre and Tzfat, and a few. That's a little bit different for this first Aliyah. A few actually were committed to living life on the land, to living of the land, to wanting to work with their hands and to reestablish a healthy and vibrant Jewish farming presence in the land, right? And even those folks who came together in small groups and built farms, they were still religious. Don't think of them as those those Zionist pioneers that were secular. They were all very religious. And maybe it's their religious impulse that called them to create those farms. And they establish over 20 new agricultural settlements between 1882 and 1903. And you will read all about it in the assigned readings this week. And these pioneers, these early non-Zionist Zionists, met really the harshest conditions. First, it wasn't easy to purchase any piece of land in the Ottoman Empire. And that's what they did. It's not like they showed up and they decided, oh, look at this hill. It'll be nice to put a farm there. Let's go do that. They had to purchase every square meter from the Ottoman Empire of the land, of the little tracts of land, the little pieces of land that they wanted to farm on. And the Ottoman Sultan made it exceedingly hard on them to do so. Oftentimes, I mean, there are stories that you can find, kind of like Pharaoh saying, yes, 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 you can buy this land here, and these people, they came with very little money. And so they cobbled together whatever the sum was. They bought the land, and then the Sultan's like, well, I'm not sure, kind of giving them a really hard time, sometimes reneging on the agreement, sometimes changing the terms. It was a really costly endeavor. But when they finally got the permit or the permits to purchase those plots of land from Constantinople, these immigrants were left with very little money to buy the tools, whatever they needed to actually farm, to build, their homes, to build whatever they needed to live off the land. But I want to insist on this point, because I think it's also very critical for us to understand that every parcel of land where these Jews decided to settle and create farms, it would have been easy to just add population to the existing towns and existing villages and just, get your little apartment there or, whatever, and just it was extremely difficult to, like I said earlier, it was difficult and dangerous to live outside the walled cities, right? But as they still committed to do that, every parcel of land outside of those cities was purchased from the Ottoman Sultan. And what they purchased was the land that belonged to the Ottoman Empire. Right? They didn't purchase land from anyone else, right? They purchased empty, unoccupied tracts of land from the Turks, right? And everything they bought, everything they were allowed to buy, and again, that was never a foregone conclusion, everything they bought was only because they were authorized by the Ottoman authorities and because they had legally purchased those places, those pieces of land. And again, like I said earlier, they didn't hold a dream of a future Jewish state. For them, it was like, no, we just want a place to live, a place to farm, and we want to purchase that so that it's ours, right? And so they had no notion of, oh, one day this will be, all of these hills and mountains will belong to the Jewish people. That was not in their consciousness. They never came there and say, oh, we will remove all the Christians and the Muslims from this land so that we can create a state. That's not what they thought of or conceived of at all. That wasn't there for them. Um, they had just escaped the pogroms, and they looked to restart their lives far from Europe, and to use the blessing for the Tsar, since we were talking about Fiddler on the Roof. Their blessing was, may God keep the Tsar far away from us. And that's why they moved there. They were trying to put the Tsar far away from them. And again, they also joined Muslims and Christians in the cities, in the towns, um, as they also settled those little tractates of farmland. And with all that, because if getting there wasn't hard enough, if finding the money wasn't hard enough, if negotiating with the Sultan wasn't hard enough, they were not farmers. They were not farmers. If you remember last week, I said, one of the czars at the time tried to get the Jews to farm the land, of Eastern Europe, and that was a complete fiasco. That was a complete disaster. They were not farmers, right? And so all of those farms, all of those farms, the 20 farms that they tried to build, they failed completely. They were just terrible at farming. I mean, it was already difficult to get all the stuff you needed to farm, but they had no idea how to do that, right? And so, as refugees from mostly Eastern Europe, none of them really would have survived the conditions of the Holy Land. I mean, think about it. You came overnight with whatever you could carry from Lithuania, from Poland, from Ukraine. Like, we're talking about some of the coldest places on earth. We're talking about blizzard. I mean, I'm picturing those countries, and this is like you're fighting to survive because of the cold. And now you have this notion that you're going to go live your life and farm the desert of the Middle East, where it's like 90 degrees at night. Like, just the climate change would have been so hard on their bodies, on their constituencies, on their ability to just to feel any kind of comfortable living there. Like, what possessed them? Sometimes I wonder what possessed these people to get up one day and say, oh, we're gonna go farm the desert in the Ottoman Empire from Vilna. It's like, what were you thinking, right? And really, those farms failed because they were first of all, there were diseases in the Ottoman Empire they had never encountered, that they were not able to acclimate literally to the harsh condition of the Middle East, and they were not farmers. They were just simply not farmers. And frankly, none of those 20 farms would have survived if it were not for the largesse, and that's a good French word, of one man. And actually, the fact that largesse is a good French word is good because that one man is a Frenchman, and his name was the Baron Edmond de Rothschild, although in French they probably pronounced it differently, of the French Jewish branch of the Rothschild family. And Rothschild bankrolled the economically floundering new farming settlement, and not just bankroll them, but put them under the control of his own, let's say, farming knowledgeable overseers. So he sent them money, but he also sent them money with strings attached. He said, I'm sending you money, but I'm also sending you people who know how to farm, who are going to follow my orders, and are going to help you create sustainable, viable farms according to them, right? So, of course, that was the blessing and the curse. The blessing was that they had, the finance now necessary to make the necessary purchases for them to actually do the farming as it in a way that would be sustainable. They also were gifted the know-how from these overseers that came from Europe, that came from France. And so they got to learn from them. But the curse part of the blessing is that they now had to obey and follow to the T the orders and desires of their benefactors. And so they became, in fact, the workforce of agricultural projects that they no longer recognized. And they became forced to grow crops that they didn't want to grow. And so soon, because of the way those overseers divided and conquered, they also found themselves resorting to hiring cheap Arab labor, Arabs who came to find work. It was difficult to find work on the land, and they came to find work. They heard about these Jews who were floundering in the land, and they came and said, we were looking for work, and so they were hired. And so those Arabs came and obviously, built and lived in huts and shanty towns that were created around these new Jewish farms. And eventually, the Arabs began to outnumber the Jews in their own villages. And what that did is that it had the effect of transforming the Jews who had come to work the fields with their hands into the overseers of their Arab workforce. Right? They were the overseer of the Arab workforce, and they were overseers overseeing them, being overseers of the Arab workforce. And thus he transformed their ideal farms into, I would call it plantations. That's really what they turned out to be, which is exactly the opposite of what they had come to do when they first emigrated, when they first made Aliyah in the 1880s. And a lot of them completely disillusioned by what their ideals had become, how they betrayed themselves in doing that. Actually, most of them broke away from those farms. At least they tried to break away from those farms. And they tried to break away from the Rothschilds administrators and being dependent upon them. They left their initial villages and they once again tried their luck somewhere else. And so they started the whole process all over again. And we know that try as they might have, they were not completely successful in their second try either. Again, the land of Palestine was a very hard land to, I remember when I first arrived in Israel, when I first met Aliyah and went to found the office of the person I was supposed to talk to about getting a room in the dorms at the University of Jerusalem. And I will forever remember that there was a poster on her door. And as I went to knock on her door, I saw the poster. And the poster was basically sand, like the desert, with thistles, with um, branches that you know, dried out branches with prickles everywhere. And it says, we never promised you a land of milk and honey. You know, it's like that what you get is the desert with dried prickly plants. That's what you get for coming. And I think that's what they didn't know they were going to get into. That's they didn't know that, you know, they had such a maybe such an ideal of what the promised land was looking like that they were not prepared. Anyways, with that, there are also some inspiring stories from that first Aliyah. It's not all uh, doom and gloom. I don't want. I also don't want to say that. Um, you know, there. One of my favorite stories is the story of the man who is going to be known as Eliezer ben Yehuda, which is not his original Russian name, who insisted on propagating this idea that the Jews who came to the land should speak Hebrew. That was interesting. They should speak Hebrew, and so he had this notion that these Jews, and you'll see that that was a controversial proposition. Today we think about it as like, of course, what other language should the Jews speak? But at the time, that was not always what the people who lived there and the Zionists eventually were ready to embrace. And so he actually, nonetheless, decided that Hebrew was going to be the language of the land. We're talking in the early days, and he worked he wrote dictionaries of what a modern Hebrew language could look like. You know, because you had to modernize the biblical Hebrew. That wasn't going to work. They were, you know, it was thousands of years later, and we'll see that ultimately his vision will become a reality. So the second Aliyah, we'll talk about that later. The second Aliyah was between what we say 1904 and 1914. And that's what we'll see really is and can be defined as the Zionist movement itself, meaning a national movement to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And its father, and that's going to be the last part of tonight, and his father is a man by the name of Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl. And we have to spend some time talking about Theodor Herzl because his vision is really going to cement what Zionism will come to be. And so we can't talk about the history of Zionism without talking about the journey of Theodor Herzl. And in fact, the second of the two chapters of Sachach's book that you have assigned for this week is dedicated, the whole chapter is dedicated to the life and work of Theodor Herzl. So what I'm just going to do in the 20-ish minutes that I have left for today is just to give you some of the highlights. So Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was born into a very much assimilated Jewish family in Budapest, Hungary, in 1860. And in the footstep of his mother, he was completely in love with German culture, German philosophy, German everything. And therefore, he majored in high school, as you could do at the time, in German literature and history. And because both he and his mother were so enamored with all things German, they actually spoke German at home and not Hungarian. In 1878, at the age of 18, he and his family relocate to Vienna, and there he enters law school. But law school really wasn't his thing. He really had set his sights onto becoming a playwright. He wanted to be a playwright. He wanted to be a journalist instead. And though he finished law school, he eventually finds himself at the just after college writing for the Viennese Wiener Allgemeine Zeitung, the local Viennese newspaper. And he was very successful in that capacity as a journalist. And in fact, he quickly becomes and quickly achieves a senior editorial position in that newspaper. And very quickly, his writing and his opinions earn him great fame. He, for all account and purposes, actually not only gains quite a certain fame, but also a certain amount of wealth in his journalistic journey. And ultimately, he's hired by the Neue Freie Press, I guess you would say the New Free Press, which was at the time Austria's leading newspaper. And as such, he is given the most envied position at the time in the newspaper, to become the foreign correspondent for the newspaper in Paris. In Paris. And so he moves to Paris for his job. And as he settles in Paris quickly, actually within months, he becomes very preoccupied by what he observes in the streets of Paris, in the alleys of power. And he becomes really concerned, actually, by the anti-Semitism that he is observing around him. And he scratches his head, because just 100 years after the revolution, and by the end of the 19th century, really, the emancipation of the Jews in all of Eastern Europe had been a fact on the ground. And yet, with that, anti-Semitism, he noticed, was once again on the rise. Maybe because of this difficult transition from, let's say, the times of the kings and the church to this individualistic, nationalistic consciousness. Those who felt themselves French or British or German wondered out loud if the Jews could really ever be considered one of them. They could transform themselves and be German. They could transform themselves and be French. They could transform themselves and be British. But what about those Jews? What about the Jews? Could they ever be German or French? And could we ever trust them to be German, to be fully French, to be fully British? And should we ever accept them as national equals, if that even was the case? And all of this inner conversation, in all of these lands, but also this was a national conversation. This was a political conversation. You start to have political parties running on anti-Semitic platforms. This was not just a few people talking in the back alleys of Berlin or Paris. This was right there. That was a conversation that was happening out in the open. And that conversation and that core question that they were asking about the Jews, that was the question that was termed the Jewish question. That was the Jewish question. Can Jews be national equals? Can the Jews be one of us? Can the Jews really be trusted to be German? That was the Jewish question. And that question, like I said, was hotly debated in the capital of Western Europe. And they were debating in order to find a solution to this Jewish question, to this Jewish dilemma, this nagging Jewish question. And obviously the Jews themselves, we're hearing that there's debates around them taking place in the society in which they live. And so they too were invited, whether actually invited or were feeling that they had to find their own answer to the Jewish question. They wanted to also be part of the conversation. And Herzl himself, at the beginning of his career, as he wrote in the newspapers, he wrote, maybe that was his original solution to the Jewish question. We know that, the final solution, we know what that is, ultimately, just a few decades later, because, Hitler called it the final solution, but many of us don't know the solution to what. And for those of us who don't know what he was calling the final solution, an answer to, well, it's the final solution to the Jewish question that was asked already at the end of the 19th century. And Herzl himself had an opinion on that. And he wrote at first that the only way to end anti-Semitism was by a public mass conversion of all the Jews of Europe one day at one specific time, the conversion of all the Jews of Europe to Christianity. He did not believe at the time in any other proposed Jewish solution to the Christians' Jewish question, that some, fringe Jews were floating around, that idea of, maybe we should leave, maybe we shouldn't stay, maybe we should create a national state in Palestine. That was there, but again, like I said before, that was really kind of a still small voice on the fringes of the Jewish community. It's interesting that Herzl's solution to the Jewish question in Western Europe was very similar to, without knowing about the Jewish question, those Jews who embraced socialism and communism had thought of, if only we could embrace this new political ideal, not that the Jews would have to convert, but religion would be eradicated, so we would never have that problem anymore. Either way, the Jews disappeared, right? They could have disappeared under communism because Judaism, as other religions, were no longer desired, or they could have all converted to Christianity, as Herzl at first thought was the one solution to end anti-Semitism. And it's fascinating because we tried that, and he should have known. We tried that just a few hundred years before, and that gave us the Inquisition. So that didn't work for us either, because what happened when the Jews converted or were converted by force under Christian kings and the Christian church is that the Jews embraced Christianity at the time, in the 14 and 1500s. And so because they embraced Christianity as they were told to do, they themselves, they became, because they were no longer ostracized from society as Jews, they were now Christians. They had access to the economy. Before, they were not allowed to participate fully in the economy. They had access to political power. Before that, they were not allowed to have access to political power. And some Jews even became, local priests. And what that did is that it freaked out the Christians' leadership, and they went and tried to extricate any Jewish notion, invader from Christianity, and that gave us the Inquisition. So that didn't work out. That never worked out. So I don't know why Herzl thought maybe this time it would work. If only the Jews converted to Christianity, then that would be the end of it. Clearly, he had not taken my class on anti-Semitism 2 years ago, and that's really his problem. I can't think of anything else. If only he had taken my class, he would have known better. Anyways, he actually thought, to be honest, he had heard of this, national, this crazy idea about returning to Palestine. And he wrote actually that his thought about that was that returning home to a recreated state would actually pit the Jews against each other, because he argued that the Jews over the centuries have grown too much apart. We're too much of a diverse people. We have too many different beliefs. Some of us are secular, some of us are religious, some of us are Ashkenazim, some of us are Sephardim. There is no way we're going to get along. We speak too many different languages now. We have embraced too many different cultures after so many hundreds of years. We would tear ourselves apart. It would be the worst idea is to put us all together in one place. That would be devastating. There will be a civil war between Jews immediately. He actually wrote about that. He wrote that we would not have enough in common to create a unified, viable national identity, to create a unified, viable Jewish state. That was his thinking. That is what he argued, and that is what he wrote about until the fall of 1800 I have the date wrong here, of 1894. Yeah, that should be correct, 1894. Because the Dreyfus affair, l'affaire Dreyfus, as I have learned to call it growing up in France, changed everything for him. Now, who was Alfred Dreyfus? Alfred Dreyfus was a French Jewish officer, actually important to him in that order, was French Jewish officer of the French army, who was falsely accused of leaking military secret to Germany. And Herzl, as the foreign office, the foreign journalist in Paris, was dispatched to cover the public ceremony of Dreyfus being stripped of his rank, his sword broken in two, and his humiliation before his own brothers in arms, and in fact, in the courtyard of a military base downtown in the center of Paris. And so hundreds and hundreds of Parisians came to witness the humiliation of the Jew. And these hundreds of Parisians turned into a rabid anti-Semitic mob outside the fence military courtyard, and began to shout and rattle the fences, shouting, "Death to the Jews! Death to the Jews!" And for minutes and minutes, Herzl witnessed this rage, this raging anti-Semitic shouts in the face of the humiliation of that one Jewish soldier. And Herzl couldn't believe that France, the highest civilization together with Germany the world ever witnessed, could produce so much anti-Semitic hatred. And he understood then and there that the days of the Jews in Europe were numbered. And so 2 years after the event, he published a book that he called The Jewish State, in which he forcefully argues that Jews, unfortunately, bring anti-Semitism with them wherever they go. That's really the core of his argument, that Jews bring anti-Semitism with them wherever they go. So it would be useless. It would be useless to continue emigrating to this Christian land or that Christian land, because once the Jews reach a critical mass and are able to reach a modicum of success in the societies that adopt them or they adopt, their host population will unavoidably despise and fear them. And despite the Jews' best effort to assimilate and provoke the love and respect of their Christian neighbors by adopting an excess of patriotism, speaking their neighbors' language, contributing to their culture, all was and will ever be in vain. He wrote that anti-Semitism was so deeply ingrained that there was no other solution, that was now his newfound solution, than living. He writes that maybe over time, with education, we might possibly eradicate this European hatred of the Jews. But short of that, he now believed that a faster and safer solution for the Jews would be to really get, as fast as possible, the Jews out of Europe. And though Palestine was his preferred option, understand that for him, leaving Europe felt so urgent, and this is 1896, so urgent that he was prepared to accept any piece of land that the European powers, that had colonized half of the world by that time, that the European powers would be willing to spare in their vast empires. He considered and will consider Argentina, Cyprus, South Africa, Uganda, and we'll talk about that in just a second, and even El Arish, which is a region in the Sinai Desert. To him, all of those options were worth considering to save the Jews from what he saw as an imminent catastrophe. And to the assimilated Jews of Western Europe, Herzl had become unhinged. Not only was he unhinged writing this book, but he was, in their view, endangering their communities by giving further ammunition to the anti-Semites. Even Baron de Rothschild, the same Baron I mentioned just a moment ago, who was subsidizing and really kind of enslaving the farmers of the first Aliyah, even he was appalled by the idea of Jewish statehood. Like, understand that the Baron who was supporting the farms that were happening in Israel, in Palestine at the time, was appalled by the idea of Jewish statehood. I think it reinforces the point that I was making earlier, that there was no notion at the time of a Jewish national home in Palestine when the Jews started to move back to Israel. Even the Baron of Rothschild was appalled by Herzl's book. And really, he found allies in a very small minority of Jews, and actually a handful of elite Jews at the time, who were actually willing to engage and be in contact with him. But Herzl was undeterred. I mean, he was such a powerful idea seated within him. He had this vision. He had this, and we know how right his vision was. He, undeterred, traveled to Constantinople to meet the Sultan. He meets with the Sultan and he promises the Sultan to use Jewish funds. He said, I'm going to be able to raise funds from the Jewish community to prop up the crumbling empire in exchange for a tract of land for the Jews in his empire. Right? That's what he came to say to the Sultan. The Jewish community will help you financially because your empire is in need of funds. In exchange, please give us a little piece of land in the vastness of your empire. And the Sultan would have none of it, none of it. And the Sultan wrote, actually, we have his writing. When my empire is divided, perhaps they will get Palestine for nothing, but only our corpse can be divided. I will never consent to its vivisection. That's what he wrote. Right? It's like, you're going to have to pry it out of my cold, dead hand. That's basically what the Sultan said to Herzl. But Herzl found an audience among the oppressed masses of Eastern European Jewry, who actually, contrary to Western European Jews, saw him as a savior. And so, because he got so much support from Eastern Jews, he was able to organize the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, in August of 1897. 1897. So almost 20 years already in the first Aliyah that I was mentioning earlier. And that was a great success. The Congress was a great success. And Herzl thought that there was now a governing body of this newfound movement called Zionism. And he wrote in his diary, at Basel, I think it's Basel, I founded the Jewish state. That's what he wrote. At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. That's so visionary, right? And then he continued, if I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. That's what he wrote. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. But in 50 years, he wrote, everyone will perceive this. Everyone will perceive it. Everyone will perceive it. I think about how prophetic these words. 50 years is exactly the United Nations vote on the two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, the partition of Palestine, in November of 1947. Exactly 50 years to the day, almost to the day. You know, it's almost exactly what it took for Ben-Gurion to proclaim the existence of Israel from Tel Aviv, which, by the way, in 1897, there were just sand dunes there. There was no Tel Aviv. But Herzl never got to witness any of this. Herzl was never going to witness the establishment of Israel because he actually died. He actually died completely exhausted. I think the book explains that. He died completely exhausted from those 7 years of wandering the world and trying to get any traction. He died in 1904, 7 years after the first Jewish Congress, Zionist Congress. But, you know, for him, really, for him, he dies thinking that he failed. He dies thinking that he had not accomplished any of what he had said to do 7 years earlier. He didn't really see that the movement was growing. What he saw was in all of his travels, in talking to all of the great powers, in talking many times back with the Sultan, he only kept hitting wall after wall after wall of rejection. And he also even saw a Jewish anti-Zionist movement growing in opposition to his work. Again, because especially Western Jews felt that he was giving ammunition to the anti-Semites, that he was disrupting, that he was giving ideas that shouldn't even exist, right? Because the Jews of Western Europe, the most assimilated Jews at the time, for them, and they made that argument loud and clear as well. Their current countries in Europe and in America were their homeland, and they made the case that Judaism as a religion was a matter of private faith and had nothing to do with their national identity. And in 1902, just 2 years before his death, Herzl understood that he was not going to get anywhere. Especially, he was trying for 5 years to convince, because he was trying to convince Germany and the Sultan in Constantinople. That was really where he placed his focus. He thought, because Germany was the great power of the time, that if he could get Germany to back him, and he tried all kind of strategies, then the Sultan would say, all right, okay. But that never happened. And in 1902, he decided to shift his strategy from Berlin to London. And in London, actually, he was met with greater support. The colonial secretary, someone, I don't know if you heard of it, known as Joseph Chamberlain. Joseph Chamberlain was really amenable to a Jewish settlement in some part of the British Empire. Some place, he said, that, would be sparsely inhabited. That's where the ideas of Cyprus came up. The idea of El Arish in the Sinai came up. And those, maybe in those parts of the British Empire, we could find a place for the Jews to resettle. There was a part of the European consciousness, maybe we can get rid of the Jews as well. So it's not a bad idea if we put them, in the Sinai. That could work. But obviously, the local governors refused categorically to import a problem where in their region there was no problem, or so they thought. And so, just before his death, Herzl writes Alt Neuland, the old new land, and he writes about a vision of a rebuilt Zion 20 years away. And it depicts his utopian Zion as a liberal democracy that would have open borders, welcoming of all its neighbors. Of course, as I mentioned, in 1902, Arab states didn't exist yet. There was just the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And so Herzl could really imagine, and let his imagination run wild. And because of that, he also couldn't imagine a state of conflict with the the Jewish states, the future Jewish states' Arab neighbors. What he wrote about and foresaw was a very tolerant land where people would treat each other with great respect, where everybody would benefit in shared progress and prosperity in a brotherly, sisterly, interfaith society. That's his book. That's what he writes about. He saw a Jewish commonwealth, and that commonwealth had no army because for him there was no need of armies. There were never going to be any wars to be fought. In his utopian vision, you can also, beautiful as it may sound, you can also really hear how clueless really he was. I mean, yes, it's beautiful, but he didn't understand Arab culture. He didn't understand Muslim culture whatsoever. He had no notion of who these people were, not just the Muslims, but the Christians who lived there as well. He had no understanding that the Arab Muslim culture saw Christians and Jews as dhimmis, second-class citizens that should be protected, but only if they accept Islam's supremacy, right? And he didn't know that. He didn't see that. He didn't understand the stratification of Jewish and Christian life in the Ottoman Empire. That Jews and Christians were tolerated, but they were second-class citizens because Islam reigned supreme. And so he couldn't foresee that Jews, could be seen as equals to Muslims in Muslims' land, right? He couldn't understand that would completely upend the concept of dhimmis in religious Muslim consciousness. And he also failed to grasp in his idealistic vision that Muslim considered Jerusalem, the Al-Quds, the holy, right? And they considered Jerusalem, and by extension, the entire region that surrounded it, as holy and as part of what they call Dar el-Islam, the abode of Islam. They didn't understand that they would never relinquish it to dhimmi Jews. And I'm mentioning that, because there's a real dangerous blind spot here. There's a real dangerous blind spot and lack of education for supposedly the most educated people on the planet at the time. Because that blind spot and that lack of education wasn't just a Herzl problem. It would plague, as we will see, the Zionist movement from its inception. And that's a really important point that I really wanted to make today. And as I am ending, and you can read all about Herzl in the book, I'm just going to end with the fact that, with all its limitations, and some of them, as I just mentioned, are going to prove dangerous to the movement. His vision was still incredibly prophetic, right? He was very driven by that vision. And he predicted a catastrophe for the Jews of Europe decades before we know what will unfold. He had seen it. He had seen it in 1894. He had already seen it. And he also had seen the creation of the Jewish state. He had envisioned that, right? He had seen it as a shared place also. That's important to notice that. In a lot of ways, and I'm going to end with that, but I see him a little bit like Moses, Moses who led the Jews to the promised land, but never lived to enter the promised land, right? He died so early in the process. But I also think of him as Moses because when he started talking about this Zionist movement, the Jews of Western Europe reacted like the Jews in Egypt. They said, don't say anything, don't say anything about us leaving, right? All you're gonna do is you're gonna make the Egyptians angry against us, which is what happened, right? They made their life harsher in the story of the book of Exodus, and that's exactly what the Jews of Western Europe feared, and why they rebuked him the way they rebuked Moses at first. Telling him you're going to bring just more oppression upon us. And I can't help, with my rabbinic vision to see him a little bit as the anti-hero that Moses was. But in 1904, when he dies, Europe was heading towards two world wars, a Bolshevik revolution in the East, and a market crash in the West. And Herzl could not have foreseen the forces that were about to be unleashed. And also, he didn't understand the second title of pogroms that had just engulfed the Pale of Settlement once again in 1903, just a few months before his death. And those pogroms will actually propel Zionism unavoidably forward. But we'll see that next week. So we're going to leave it at that. Let me go through a couple of questions. How did the Baron become interested in the settlement? He was not really interested in the settlements. He was seeing that Jews were faltering and were probably dying, and he felt that he could do something about it and he could bring experts. So he brought them in and sent money, and here they went. How big were the farms? Very small, very small. They were just a handful of people. Again, understand that the totality of the first Aliyah, right, was 25,000 people. Overwhelmingly, those religious Jews came into the holy cities. And so you could think about a few hundred people, maybe 1,000 people at the most, who created 20 different farms. How did the Jews from Yemen and Russia interact with one another? They interacted, again, you have to think of them as ultra-Orthodox, right? So they probably interacted with one another as on the basis of their religion. That's their commonality, right? That's how they talked to each other. That's how they were with each other. All right, I think that's plenty for today. Email me if you have more questions. rabbi.olivier@betaleph.org. And maybe next week I'll do a little bit like today. If those questions are connected to what I'm going to teach next week or share next week, then I'll use them as a prop. I will let you know in advance. And as you can see, I don't name names, so everybody remains anonymous. Please stay with me for a few more seconds. We're going to close with a shalom chant as we do, and then go on for the rest of our night. And take a breath for shalom. Shalom. Thank you all. Good night.
Well, Danny, good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
You.
Well done, Ani. Lila